Hello, hello, everyone. It's me, Arden Lee, and I am super excited today to welcome to the channel Dr. Jamie Marich. She is the author of some really, too many books for me to name in an introduction. I think do you have over like 12 or 13 now? There's,
Something like that. Yeah, if you count the workbook, it's 13. Yeah.
oh my goodness, I'm so impressed that I just got that right off the top of my head, by the way. I'm so impressed with your work. Dr. Jamie has written this book, Trauma and the 12 Steps. She is also the author of the Trauma and the 12 Steps Workbook, which we're here to discuss today, in particular because the second edition of the Trauma and the 12 Steps Workbook comes out from North Atlantic Books on August 29th. Do I have that correct?
Correct.
Awesome. And I'm so grateful that you've made these resources available. And I want for the folks who follow me in my work to know a little bit more about them because being in the music industry myself, I see a lot of folks who, when their unresolved trauma comes up, the first place it goes to is alcoholism or substance misuse because of the typical lifestyle that is around a lot of the music industry. And for some folks, going into a 12-step program can be really helpful for them. And then for some folks, it never quite reaches the unresolved trauma that is underneath. So I'm so grateful that you've made this available so that more folks can understand what they can get out of the 12 steps and where they might have to also self-advocate or self-facilitate for the kind of things that they're going to need to really get to the root of the issue and create a sustainable solution. So first off, thank you for being here. And can you start off by telling my followers a little bit more about how you got into this work of your career?
Sure, my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. And I got in through this work because of my own mess ups around addiction. Is really how it started. I got addicted very young, and I was addicted to things before drugs and alcohol. I really believe that when I look back over the sum total of my life and needing to respond to a lot of trauma and dysfunction, being a very sensitive, highly feeling person. I think that's something musicians and artists hear a lot is how much the sensitivity can really be a gift for the art, but it can make dealing with feelings just unbearable. And that was very much my story, even as a young kid. So, I mean, I was that young kid who escaped a lot into daydreams and fantasy and what I now know as dissociation. Eating in problematic ways, getting into uh, a lot of what I call overachievement addiction. We might call it workaholism. That happened even as a teenager, pursuing a lot of things. And then once I left high school and my parents' pretty religious home, all the foundations were there to develop an addiction. Then I just needed the access, the exposure, which I certainly got at 18 when I left my parents' house. And to give you a glimpse of how bad it got, I really didn't start actively using chemicals until my late teens. And by 23, I was already needing a program of recovery because it had almost taken me out in terms of just I was that kind of suicidal drunk or suicidal pill popper where I just wanted to ingest stuff so I didn't wake up. And that was really a continuation of a lot of the mental health patterns that were there even from when I was younger, not wanting to be here, wanting to end things. So I got into this field really after I the short version of the story or the cheekier version of the story was I ran away to Europe to escape a dysfunctional relationship and a lot of problems that I
As
was
one
having
does.
here. Yeah, I was 21 and I knew I couldn't get the help I needed from my parental unit because my father was very religious and the answer was just go back to church. And my mother, God love her, very much had a you're too smart for all of this, you'll figure it out. And so my figuring it out was packing a backpack and skipping the country and going to Europe. And I said, if I'm 8,000 miles away from all these things that plague me and all these people that bother me, then maybe I'll figure it out. So in recovery circles, we sometimes call that a geographic cure, and it's used sometimes as a pejorative. But for me, it ended up being the move I needed because, yes, I agree. You could move across the country, across the world. You still take you with you. And that was very much my story. I stopped using pills when I moved, but I kept drinking a lot more. And then I had the good fortune of meeting my first recovery sponsor. I was living in the Croatian part of Bosnia Herzegovina at the time, which is where my ancestral ties are. And I was teaching English there and doing some aid work. And I met an American social worker who was also there after the war. And she had a program of recovery. And she was very much the essence of attraction rather than promotion. She didn't try to shove any of this down my throat. She was just there. She got it. She was a decent human being. And I was able to share with her a lot of my struggles with chemicals and then ultimately with trauma. And she was not only the first person who helped me see so much of my life's problems through this lens of addiction, but she was the first to use the word unhealed trauma to really describe a lot of my story and my journey. So, in the few years I spent over there, it was first about getting myself sober and reasonably well. And after I had a little bit of time, she suggested I go back to graduate school for therapy, for counseling. And I said, I hated psychology as an undergrad. What are you talking about? This is a horrible idea. And she said, trust me, I think you'll like it because over here doing aid work, you've learned a lot about the art of being a healer. Just go back, learn the science, get the letters after your name, and you'll be surprised what you could do. So I truly got into this field because somebody who had more faith in me than I had in myself at the time guided me in this direction. And that was over 20 years ago. And here we are today.
Wow, what a remarkable story. I'm familiar with that term about a geographic cure, right? Because again, wherever you go, there you are, and all your problems follow you. But I had something similar where, I moved from New York City to Los Angeles, and so much of my trauma had happened in New York. And so landing in LA and deciding also I was like, I'm gonna live alone, even if it costs more, because I had had so many bad situations of cohabitation. And it actually was the thing that allowed everything that I needed to resolve within me, the space to come up so that I could deal with it. So sometimes like when you do, I just want to second like advocating for sometimes like when you do leave the surroundings of your immediate circumstances and you give yourself that space, then things like that can come forward and be addressed. Of course, you have to do the work to address them.
I look at it now as it was a move because even a good friend of mine said, stop saying you ran away to Europe. You moved because you knew in your heart you needed something there. And it was multi-layered because I think in a lot of ways, especially from a young kid, feeling so many ties to Eastern Europe and the Slavic threads of my ancestry. And I was very involved in Slavic folklore and dance growing up. And then when I came of age during the war, because I was in high school when the homeland war was happening in Croatia, I just became very interested in learning more about my family's history and starting to learn more of the language. And I think for many of us, especially who have these ties to roots and guides, there is something very deep and meaningful about getting to our origin story and exploring the lands where we come from. And I get chills even talking about it because there was a part of me that literally needed to go home to find a lot of that. And then whether you call it higher power, universal flow, cosmic connection, or just good coincidence, I met this amazing woman, Janet, who sponsored my recovery. And what's really weird or cool or a God thing is she was only from about 45 minutes away from where I lived in Ohio, not very far at
Wow.
all. And here we met in Bosnia Herzegovina. And it was the Ohio connection that made me think, oh, wow, I'd like to talk more to her. Yet, who knows how things are supposed to work out. And for me, I'm glad I followed that inner prompting to make the move.
Very cool. Yeah, it sounds like it was guided. It sounds like it's exactly what you needed at the time. I'd love to also talk about you know, what let's start off with what about the 12 steps was really helpful for your recovery. And then maybe we'll go into, some of the things that maybe required some adaptation in order to be accessible.
Well, I am truly grateful and I recognize my privilege in what an amazing person I had in Janet to be my first sponsor, to be the person who brought me the 12 steps. Because I don't know if they would have appealed to me if I had met them like in an ordinary meeting in the US, like a lot of people do, or in an ordinary treatment center. I was willing to listen to we use this line a lot in 12 steps, her experience, strength, and hope, based on how the steps worked for her. And she was one from the beginning who really advocated for adaptation, that if some wording in these steps don't work for you, if you're at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and people are talking about alcohol in a way that connects more to drugs for you, just replace alcohol with drugs. And not everybody in 12-step cultures is that open-minded. So I'm really grateful that she came at me with the spirit of adaptation and not trying to change me. I mean, she was tough when she needed to be tough, yet she always validated me first. And I think that was a big part of why I listened to her. The biggest directive she gave me after the first major conversation I had with her talking about my addiction was, Jamie, after everything you've been through, it's no wonder you turned to drugs and alcohol. What now? Like, what's the plan now? So she would always validate me and then challenge me, which I found very useful. And another place where I know I naturally had more inclination than maybe some others for the steps to really work for me is, even after all of the spiritual and religious trauma I experienced, I never stopped believing in something divine, in some kind of cosmic flow or higher power. When I met the 12 steps, I was still really trying to figure out where I stood with God or Jesus or whatever, but the belief never stopped. And I want to validate that. I know for a lot of people who've been harmed by religion, it just does stop. And that's okay. And you may or may not find the 12 steps to be helpful for you. Yet in the 12 steps, I was honestly able to find a higher power that I knew without a doubt loves me, because so much of the higher power or God I had been raised with was very much of the fire and brimstone, judgmental, rigid variety. And I remember being about 7, 8 months sober, sitting at a meeting, and it just really overcame me that in these steps and the adaptation, especially that my sponsor allowed for, I made conscious contact with the higher power that I knew was pure love and really had my best interest at heart. So the steps, when presented in a non-rigid way, really were there to help rehab my relationship with the divine. And for that, I'm grateful.
Wow, very cool. Yeah, it's really a shame when um it's really a shame when religion and dogma get so mixed up together that they not only create a block between people and their individual relationship to a higher power or spirituality, but they also block their access to care. So, with that in mind, what are some of the catchphrases that you heard in the 12 steps? I know you've mentioned some of them in the book itself, but I'd love to hear your take on some of them in this interview. What are some of the catchphrases that you found particularly unhelpful for folks with trauma, and some of the adaptations that you made for them?
Well, let's start with the steps themselves, because I think a lot of the problems in 12-step cultures really have nothing to do with the steps themselves. Because even some of the slogans that you talk about that I go after in the book, like take the cotton out of your ears, put it in your mouth, it's not part of the steps. It's just something, it's not even in the AA big book. It's just something people have said at meetings over the years that I think can be very unhelpful, or you're only as sick as your secrets. And those are slogans where, yeah, the intent is don't bury it down. Yet I think it could be very insulting the way we talk to people, because for so many folks, keeping a secret was part of how they stayed alive, right? But in the steps themselves, I like to unpack some of the problem words that people can encounter. And one of them happens right away in the first step. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable, or whatever the addiction may be. And a lot of survivors of trauma really struggle with that word powerless, because we can see it as, well, we're admitting that we're deflated, defeated, that we don't have power, that we're not a powerful person. And for a lot of people, I am powerless really becomes a negative trauma cognition. And I had a friend early in my recovery really explain it to me when I was overthinking it too much, is you're not saying in the step, I'm a powerless person. The step is really saying when you put that drug in your system, it's probably going to win. And that's when I was really able to see it as it's a form of surrender, which shows up in many different spiritual paths and many different spiritual traditions. That when you can like enough, like it's going to win, why risk it? I actually tapped into a big deal of power within me and realized how powerful I am by being able to admit that surrender. So I think that's a case of a word where I just really had to dance with it a little bit to see the step is not saying what I think a lot of survivors with trauma can see it to say. All that, if my modification doesn't work for you and the steps aren't for you, I'm not forcing that on you either. But I would ask you to consider, might surrendering in some way, in some, whether it be a secular or spiritual path, hold some part of the answer for you. And another step concept that a lot of trauma survivors struggle with can happen in step 6, where we talk about character defects. And that can be a tripping point for a lot of folks who carry a negative cognition or core belief like I am defective. So something I actually learned in Workaholics Anonymous is that you can replace something like character defect with negative coping skill. And even
Nice.
one of my good buddies in recovery said maybe it's just an emotionally dissociative part that developed to help you get a need met or to help you protect yourself. So I'm fascinated by language. And a lot of that, I believe, is we started as an English teacher. When we were working in Bosnia, we were teaching English and have a degree in American Studies, which is the pop culture part of our English department at the university I went to. And so the English language truly fascinates me by looking at things like word origin and modification and how we could even sit with the way a certain word or phrase activates us and notice where that's coming from, challenge ourselves to either sit with it until it shifts or to ask myself, is there a more adaptive or more appropriate way for me that I can express this?
That sounds so brilliant. It actually reminds me a lot of the language that I use in the repatterning project, where we
Mm.
talk about internal algorithms, like if X, then Y, right? Because as we are interacting with the world around us, we're constantly learning through our experience. And someone who develops, an addiction to alcohol, for example, probably like learned very early on in their drinking, like, oh, if I take a drink, then
Mm-hmm.
I feel better and I'm more sociable. And
Right.
the catch with that is that that's actually true up to a certain point, right? And then we hit something called the law of diminishing returns, where we continue the original strategy, trying to still meet that underlying need. And what I like about that framework, which it sounds like yours is also very similar, is that we acknowledge that the underlying need is legitimate. Like you want to feel better and you want to be able to be more sociable or feel more included. And that it's really just like the variable that you are putting into the algorithm of the alcohol, which seemed like a good idea at first, but which eventually reaches that point of diminishing returns and then starts to become a problem. So by validating that underlying need and then simply saying, can we find a different strategy to have this need met, I feel like that also like helps folks release a lot of shame around that. So tell me more about how um, specifically framing things as coping mechanisms and finding better ways to cope and acknowledging that underlying need. Like in your experience, how has that helped with folks releasing shame?
Right. Well, as you know from reading my work, for me, addiction is simply a manifestation of dissociative processes. And dissociation, to dissociate simply means to sever or to divide. And as kids, when you grow up in a lot of trauma or dysfunction, it can be very natural and normal to sever somehow. Like I mentioned, daydreaming was a hardcore thing for me as a little kid to get out of the situation. And as Janet helped me understand, even before I knew what dissociation was as a clinician, she said this escaping you did in your head kept you alive in your house. Let's send it some gratitude. Let's honor it for what it was. And then at a certain point, especially as you neared adulthood, it seemed to really backfire on you because it kept you from living in the reality you were asked to live in. And So what a lot of my recovery has been about is how can I still keep some of those daydreaming and imaginative gifts while also challenging myself to be in the present. And I think for a lot of us who develop dissociative tendencies very young, then once chemicals enter the picture and we learn a lesson like, oh, it helps me deal with my mom's skeezy friend when I'm around him at family events. Of course, I'm going to get drunk or high. Then it helps us realize that that we can accelerate our dissociative tendencies. We can make that necessity to sever or separate much more intense and much more immediate. And so if we're looking at addiction as a continuation of dissociative processes that a lot of us develop, dissociative processes or tendencies happen to either meet a need or to protect the self. And for many of us, it's both. So I think with anybody's chemical use, it's worth in doing just some inventory, not even 12-step style inventory, but just kind of some introspective inventory. How did this help me get a need met? And or how did it protect me? And it could be simply, how did it protect me from feeling these intense feelings in an environment, in a space, in a home where maybe I got punished for feeling feelings? So these are all interesting questions to ask that I think tie into your work and what you do with helping people see their patterns and shift them.
Yeah, something you said during because I took your addiction as dissociation training back in the spring. Which was so great, by the way. I was so happy that I was able to be a part of that class. And something you said towards the end, but it absolutely blew my mind was because I'm on the dissociative spectrum. I don't experience dissociative identities because I think it's because I have a really strong memory. And so I've had a very coherent timeline, for me. But I do experience dissociation from my body, from sensation for a very, very long time. And I accelerated that through a BDSM lifestyle, actually. through through essentially like the practice of sadomasochism and like how much my body could endure as a sport. So I identify a lot with specifically with that daydreaming and and just going away from places and having that being a way of coping with sensations that my body ultimately did not want to handle. And something you said during the training was that we can actually develop an addiction to the endogenous opioids that our brain releases when we and I you said that and I was like, that's me. I was like, I had no idea. Like, you can literally develop a chemical addiction, right? Do I even need to put that in air
Yeah.
quotes? Like, to daydreaming.
If I, putting it very simply, this is very layperson's terms and the way I understand the neuroscience. Yes, our body produces its own feel good chemicals. I mean, a lot of us, at least colloquially know what dopamine is, but this whole idea of the endogenous opioid system is our body's natural tendency to produce feel good chemicals to combat pain, however pain may happen, especially physically. Yeah, and in the words of my collaborator Adam, we could become bonded to that. We can become attached to that. And it speaks to a larger phenomenon that even things that are good for us, because I'm definitely not one to kink shame at all, and even things that can be good and pleasurable and helpful for us, exercise is another example. Like exercise can be taken too far. Um, if the attachment becomes something that doesn't serve us in the long run and can lead to some
Absolutely.
feels even more problematically addictive, or I should say less helpfully addictive.
Yeah. The saying that I love around that is that anything can be a medicine and anything can be a poison. And the difference between medicine and poison sometimes is just dose.
And or the intention, dose and or the intention. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Glad we're talking about this.
Me too. So getting back to 12-step meetings and 12-step culture, what are like let's say someone notices that they have an issue with alcoholism or substance misuse and they begin attending meetings. How might they begin to explore or know if they also have unresolved trauma that is exacerbating the problem? Because some of what I've seen is that especially like especially when drinking is a part of the lifestyle and culture that is surrounding you. I've seen folks get into 12-step programs, and there's sometimes, as I understand it, there's a difference between folks with unresolved trauma who have something really deeper that they need to resolve in them in order to not need the dissociation of drinking, versus people who are just involved in a lifestyle, who are heavy drinkers, and they go to a few meetings and they're like, oh, I'm better because I just stopped the pattern that I was doing. And essentially it almost sounds to me like some folks, and if that works for them, amazing, right? But some folks, it sounds like, almost go into recovery when what they really need is a tolerance break. Like, they break the
Right.
pattern, they take a break for 6 months or so, and then you'll see them kind of drinking again, because they'll be like, oh, well, don't tell anyone I went to AA with, but yeah, I'm having a beer tonight, but I'm only going to have one or two. And that's fine. Like, hey, I do the same thing with cannabis. I have a relatively healthy relationship with cannabis, where I can dial it back if I notice myself doing it too much or too often. So how does one know if you're going to go into a recovery program? What I guess what I want to talk about is, like, if it's not working for someone in the way that they see it working for other people, what are the ways to find the real root of the issue and dispel the shame that comes around when something doesn't work for you?
Well, I'm going to say something that definitely is not a popular opinion with a lot of old school AA people, or with a lot of like overly cognitive therapists that are out there. And that is, if you end up in a program or a room of recovery, and even in some level you feel like you belong, or that's something that's being said applies to you, you probably have some unresolved trauma somewhere. Now, I want to qualify that by saying trauma is a spectrum. Trauma comes in various shapes and sizes. I know there's a lot of criticism now that, oh, we're calling everything trauma, or trauma's been blown so out of proportion. Trauma just means wound. I think you know this from reading my work. That's a hallmark of understanding. Wounds come in various shapes and sizes. Wounds hit certain people harder than others. If we're looking at physical wounds, if someone's immunocompromised, or if proper treatment wasn't received at the time. I had a very recent experience a few weeks ago where a bug bite sent me to the hospital.
Wow.
Something that relatively innocuous, but it infected. I ended up getting a blood infection from it. And I think if we're getting judgy, it's like, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal because it was a small wound. Well, small wounds that infect can become very big deals, and large wounds that get treated properly may end up not being an issue in the long run. So I really think anybody who ends up having any kind of issue with addiction, if you don't like the word trauma, there's usually some stuff, there's some wound underlying that needs to be attended to. And why do some people seem to get it easier than others? I don't know. Maybe it's because the level of the wounding is not as layered and as multifaceted. And usually, if you see yourself continuing to struggle, it's a pretty good sign that, and even 12 steps would say this, like, outside help may be needed. Getting a trauma professional involved in some level could certainly be needed, either in place of the 12 steps or to supplement the 12 steps. But I've also seen people who don't drink and go to meetings and can get sober, and they could stay sober for many, many years, but they're still a wreck in a lot of other areas of their lives, which can show me that a lot of the treatment, or even the use of AA, has been more like a band-aid on the wound
Yeah,
instead of really allowing healing to happen.
it can be like whack-a-mole with our coping mechanisms too, right? Like, we get it over here and then pops up over there. And something that I do in the repatterning project actually is, we take everyone through the PTSI, the post-traumatic stress index, which is the assessment that was developed by Patrick Carnes and David Delmonico in 2008. And so my assistant and I, we go through it every time, and we have many alumni come back into the course and do it, because I let alumni return for, like, basically a fraction of the original price. So we have folks who go through the program multiple times. And so we'll do the PTSI again, and we'll notice that, like, wherever our trauma, for those who are not familiar with the post-traumatic stress index, it's basically an assessment that shows you 8 different profiles of how your trauma may be manifesting in your behavior. And
Yep.
so we'll get we'll get one column and we'll be like, oh, I'm really gonna work on that. And then like 6 months later, we do it again and we're like, oh, now it's all over here in this column. So yeah, it certainly can shift around a lot. And just because someone is dealing with a substance issue doesn't necessarily mean, if they don't resolve that trauma, it may crop up other places in their lives. So how is a good way to tell, if you're someone who is in recovery, how is a good way to tell, if that does differentiate you, if you do need, like what would be some ways to know that you might also want to get a trauma professional involved?
It's a great question. I think I'm going to go with what my gut is giving me as the first answer, because this
Always
is
love that.
hard.
Yeah.
This is hard if you're in recovery. Um, Notice the relationships in your life, with your significant other, with your children, with your friends. And if they seem to be pretty good quality relationships, great. But if you notice there's an area where you're struggling to connect, or if you're getting feedback from the other person, like, Dad, it's great you're not drinking anymore, but you're still a pretty miserable bastard. Listen to that. I mean, that's a sign that something may need to be addressed. If it feels like life is still hard, like our story was very much, we were 2 years chemically sober and still felt like we wanted to die most days, or wanted to get out of here most days. And so there's this phenomenon that when the addiction itself clears up, which can be very much like bandaging the wound, the underlying stuff will show up one way or another. So I think you listen to the feedback around you from relationships you care about, notice your mental health. And if life is still feeling like a struggle more days than not, yeah, it's probably a sign. And sometimes it's life transitions that reveal it. A phenomenon we talk about a lot in post-traumatic stress studies is delayed expression PTSD. And the stereotypical or prototypical case of this is Vietnam veterans, for instance, who they came back from war feeling like, I'm fine. I jumped in, I did life, I got a job, I got married. And then either when they retire or when their spouse passes away is when you see a lot of this bubble up and resurface. For a lot of survivors of sexual trauma, it could happen when the abuser dies or when someone close to the abuse dies.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
if you're going through a major adjustment like a job loss, or just periods of life transitions, or things that are connected to the trauma itself resurfacing, if that's causing some kind of distress in you, that's also probably a sign that something may, and I want to say, it's not a shame thing. It's not like, see, you didn't deal with it, because I hate when we do that as trauma professionals. You'll need to heal. I'm always going to be healing, and I feel very impassioned about communicating that to people in trauma world. Don't get so damn judgy about when people's wounds still surface, because especially when you've been traumatized in a very developmental, complex way, life will continue to reveal stuff that maybe you weren't aware of, or it didn't feel so relevant until the life transition revealed it. So be kind to yourself, and let's, be kind to each other.
Not only that, but one of the things that I really enjoyed from my neurolinguistic programming certification is this idea that everyone is always doing the best they can with what they have at the time. And I know for me, because I was definitely stuck in a lot of addictive and dissociative patterns for a long time until I moved out to LA, and then everything came up and I started working with a number of spiritual facilitators, doing plant medicine ceremonies. But I look back at who I was in my 20s, for example, before all of that could happen. And I often wonder, like, how so much of my own work today is driven by, like, how would I explain this to my former self who didn't understand it, and Maya Salovitz, who is the author of Unbroken Brain, which is another book that I really love on addiction, talks about something called the trapdoor paradigm, where it's like, if someone is a prisoner in a jail cell, and they could be there, and by all appearances, there's no way out of the cell. There's bars, there's locks, etc. but there's a trap door that's there. And if the moment that they're aware of it, then they're like, oh, there's a trap door, I can actually get out. But until you're aware of the trap door, you're going to be stuck there. And what I see also is that if we have invested, especially if we're someone who's smart, and especially if we're someone who prides ourselves on our intelligence and our adaptability, which so many trauma survivors do. I know I certainly did and do. Sometimes even finding out that there's a trap door there, we're like, no, there can't possibly be a trap door there, because why would I have spent so long in this jail cell if there were a trap door there the whole time? So for someone who is dissociated, especially because so often we can tend to take on dissociation as a coping mechanism so that we can get through our lives without needing to confront how maybe, messed up or bad things actually are. We can take on this attitude of, it's fine, I'm just going to get through it, I've been through everything else, I'm just going to get through the day, and it'll, I'm not going to get upset, it'll all take care of itself. So when someone is in that space, how can a person either help themselves or receive help, or how can a program or a friend help them, to kind of get the things that they would need to get in order to get out, assuming they're already doing the best that they can? How can we how can we help that process sometimes?
It's
I
a
know I'm
great
asking all
question.
the easy questions today, right?
Great question. And even as you're talking, as the person who's often cast in the role of helper, right? As the therapist, I've also been a loved one to so many people who struggle with addiction and mental health issues. Sometimes, as the helper, we do our best to give suggestions like, look, there's a door. Here's how you can use it. But often, when I let go of my need to be so overly helpful, is when that other person finally realizes it. Looking at my own story, I don't know why it connected on July 8th, 2002. Having struggled like a year and a half previous, and knowing that so many other people out there struggle a heck of a lot longer than a few years. I'm evidently this professional who knows a lot, but I do not know, other than I know this is a program slogan, which is a little cheesy, like I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And it's like, well, why don't I try this door? What's the use? But I think for so many of us, there's a fear of what's going to happen if I go through this door, because at least staying in my jail cell feels comfortable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of attachment or addiction, if you want to use that word, we could feel to that state of comfort even in the pain, as opposed to, and I think a lot of folks who are addicted or struggle, a friend of mine ran this idea by me a few years ago. It's like our two biggest fears are fear of failure and fear of the unknown.
Mm.
Like what will happen if I try something else? And I say that with great kindness to folks, because even in the relational part of my life with romantic relationships, we are still figuring that out, even though we have pieced it together in a lot of other areas of our life. Like, ooh, there's a door, let me try another door. So yeah, it's a great question. And I also feel, and this may be an idea that's controversial to a lot of other addiction thinkers out there, the more we say we know about addiction, this is why I'm answering from this place of, sometimes when I let it go and just let the other person have their own discovery, that's when it happens. Yeah, I don't have all the answers, nor does any other addiction thinker that's out there.
It's amazing how similar that is to so many spiritual principles I've learned as well, of surrendering attachment to outcome, for example, and how counterintuitive it is. And as you're saying this, I'm like, wow, I've experienced that. I've experienced that the minute that I accept things exactly as they are is the only time when things can start to change. That change actually starts with acceptance of circumstances, because if you're trying to fight against something, you can't change it nearly as well as if you fully accept it for what it is, let it be there in the moment and let it land, and then, then say, well, here we are. How do we then move forward?
I just come to believe that I don't know are the three most spiritual words in my vocabulary.
I
And
love that.
that is at the program of recovery that is the 12 steps started me on that path. And I think other influences have come into my life, especially as my spirituality's developed and I've explored other things that really has shown me the power of surrender, the power of, yeah, I can admit in my confidence that I have a lot of knowledge. I've learned a lot of things. And I can say that like it's a beautiful thing to ask questions. Like I love asking questions. I love answering questions. I think that that's how we grow as thinkers and people in recovery. And sometimes the answer is there's really no answer to that question right now. Can I just sit with the unknown? And that is a deep spiritual practice to learn how to do that and be okay with not knowing.
Oh yeah, I would say that's probably been one of the most challenging things on my path. Is as a Gemini rising, I'm an information junkie. So there's always that curiosity. There's always that need to know. We talked earlier about when someone may stop drinking and get sober, by all standard metrics, but still not have dealt with their unresolved trauma. For folks who are chronic relapsers, like what, on the other side of the spectrum, what about trauma informed care? Like what can that teach us about folks who are chronic relapsers who can't, for whatever reason, seem to stay sober as some other folks might be able to?
Yeah, it's a good question. Chronic relapsers is a phrase I don't really like. I know what you mean, by it. I often think of it as just folks who haven't figured it out yet. And something I will say to people who do relapse, if they resonate with that word, is if you had some time, that time is not lost time. Like even if you stayed sober for a day or two, what did you learn from that? And you can continue going on with it. Because I think some traditionally A folks can get into this. Well, if you've relapsed, like you start all over again from ground zero. And
That's
yeah,
got to be so frustrating, right?
I don't think you've lost what you've gained. But I think asking a lot of these same questions that we've been talking about throughout the interview, like how did picking up again protect you? How did it help you to meet a need?
Mm.
Knowing what happened, what can you do differently this time? And I think a lot of it is the mindset. So years ago, gosh, I can't believe how long ago this was now. 2008, 2009 is when I did my doctoral research. And there was a woman I interviewed in that study. She was not my client. She was someone at another facility I interviewed who had something like 26 engagements in treatment. She had been in and out that many times.
Wow.
And the facility where I was investigating, where she got what she needed to get, I think she had 3 years in recovery at the time I interviewed her. She said, everybody at this facility made me believe like I could do it. Like, okay, you had 25 prior treatments. Now it's 26. Now's the time. You can do it. And she said just that attitude of hope she was met with, which is fundamentally something that's very, very trauma focused and trauma responsive, was so much different than a lot of other hospitals and other treatment centers she'd been to where people just rolled their eyes at her. Like, oh, you're a chronic relapser means you're a chronic failure. And just the attitude that she encountered at this facility, which was very trauma informed, just made all the difference.
I love how you frame that as what underlying need were you meeting by relapsing? Because that, again, that speaks to the legitimacy, because at the end of the day, all behavior is motivated. And so if we
Correct.
find that underlying need, we can address it in some different ways. For folks who perhaps like black out, who either black out with drinking or in some cases may be experiencing dissociative amnesia in addition, that's one thing, for example, uh, um, that I find it's such a gray area that I find so kind of difficult. Like for example, the multidimensional index of dissociation, the mid test, which I know you're familiar with. I know, right? I'm looking through the questions on that, and it's like, tell me when this happens, but without influences of alcohol or substances. And I'm like, what if you have a dissociative identity that likes to drink and has
Yeah.
actually not been embodied, has not been, maybe like, you've been going to AA meetings, but meanwhile, you have a dissociative identity that has not actually been present in the body during your meetings and doesn't care about your sobriety. So I think, what happens when whether due to plain blackout drinking or due to dissociative amnesia that may take over when the relapse is happening, how would you approach working with someone who doesn't remember the need that they were meeting when they started drinking?
It's a good question, yet it's one that's hard to answer simply because it largely depends on the person or the individual or the system. And I tend to adopt an attitude with all my clients of curiosity, like, knowing what you know about past patterns or what you know about your current part structure, what could have happened. And I think you can start a discussion from there. You can bring in some somatic elements to that discussion. It's something that is largely individualized. Yet, I think whether you're, a coach, a teacher, a provider, a sponsor, a therapist, the underlying tone I would take is one of not shaming a person for that happening. That it may have just been a natural survival protection that kicked in. Now, not letting you off the hook if it caused other people harm, because hopefully that's motivation for you to really kind of better understand what happened and look at this, or caused yourself harm. Yet, explore these things with an attitude of curiosity.
Speaking of harm that happens, especially during relapses or during dissociative fugues, um, I very deeply understand the need to really refrain from using any language around that, that is shaming. And yet, at the same time, if there is harm, how do you balance that line with especially if a trauma survivor is already feeling an intense amount of shame just as their baseline? Sometimes, as I understand it, dissociating from the harm that has happened or saying like, oh, it's okay, or I'll get through it, or it's just me, it doesn't matter, it's just my own internal experience, if the harm is the harm to self. How would you encourage someone to take accountability for that harm or deal with it without compounding the shame that they're already feeling, if like sometimes even pointing them in that direction can cause them to again shut down and want to dissociate from that reality?
Well, and that's where I think doing the fourth and fifth step with somebody who really gets trauma is the key, because in the 12-step programs, the fourth and fifth step are the inventory steps where you really look at your behaviors and actions and how they impacted yourself and others. And where the fourth and fifth step can be a disaster for a lot of folks is if they either try them on their own or they try them with an old school sponsor or therapist who's all about shame. And so, like in trauma in the 12 steps, I go into how before you even try step 4 and 5, can we look at some embodied coping that you can take once you start working these steps and you notice some body triggers come surfacing. And I think the fourth and fifth step can be brilliant if you're doing them either with a therapist or a sponsor who is so much like my Janet, who said, listen, after everything you've been through, it's no wonder you did these things. What now? Because I really believe, and this is where, a lot of people on more the trauma end of things don't like what I have to say sometimes, that trauma is not an excuse to poor baby, poor baby, poor baby people, because that pity ends up getting people in a lot of trouble too. So how can we hold this both and of showing extreme compassion for the person while also, all right, what now? How can we best help you clean this up and, operate in a way that might be more serving for you going forward?
Yeah. And bringing it back, of course, because I want to bring it back to the workbook, which, of course, we're here to promote today because it's going to be coming out in just a few short weeks. So I've noticed in the workbook that you have a lot of really cool exercises for taking folks through the steps in a more trauma informed way with your voice and your co-author's voice, Stephen Dansiger, who you co-wrote the book with, really dropping in and explaining in a compassionate way the way that the steps can be repurposed or done with a trauma-informed lens. So tell us just a little bit more about some of the exercises in the books that folks can look forward to if they pick this up when it comes out.
Right. Well, one of the first things we do is in each step, we share a little bit of our personal experience with the step, because Steve and I are both trauma survivors ourselves who have a lot of stories to tell. And we'd like to just kind of put a human face on the step to start each step chapter. And then we invite people to really look at, okay, what are your problems with this step? What words might you find activating? What might be your struggle in working this step? Because I think we have to honor a person's struggle or tender points first before we can get them into working the step. And then we just give some guided exercises for how you might be able to use these tender spots as a way to better do some inventory or do some free writing around each step. We acknowledge that some of our readers are doing them for the first time. Some of our readers are doing them multiple time through the steps, and gear questions in that directive. And we also give an expressive arts option because many people find writing to be the barrier. So we give people a chance to do something like a collage or free drawing, or maybe the scribbling leads you to writing. And with Steve and I both being expressive artists, visual artists, and musicians, we just find that to be a very important option that sometimes we can get so hung up on the words. Whereas there may be other channels we can use to really help us embody or work the spirit of that step.
Nice. Well, thank you again so much for being here today. I want to be mindful of your time naturally, and I know we're coming up on the hour. So I just want to remind everyone again that Trauma and the 12 Steps, the workbook, comes out again August 29th on from North Atlantic Books, and you can get that pretty much wherever books are sold. And Trauma and the 12 Steps, of course, is the the book that goes along with that. I definitely recommend reading that. This for me, it was such an amazing, edifying and validating read. And also, of course, I'm going to also promote your book, Dissociation Made Simple, which I also really loved. I was sharing with Dr. Jamie earlier, my copies of these books are all underlined and read multiple times. So I'm so grateful for our conversation today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me ask some of the maybe maybe slightly more challenging or nuanced questions, but it means so very much that you dropped in with me today and that we were able to have this conversation. Is there anything else about your work that that you'd like to share, or where people can find you?
Redefinetherapy.com is probably the best website to give people connected to new book projects. Myname.com, you can also find anything I'm involved with. I'm on the socials, Instagram, Dr. Jamie M. I also have an account on TikTok, Trauma Therapist Rants, which has an Instagram as well. You'll find me. If you Google my name, you'll find me. And just thank you for the questions. I adore having these kind of nuanced discussions, and I very much enjoyed connecting with you and your work online. And it was great to actually get together for a conversation.
Same. Thank you again so much. And thank you all to everyone out there who gave this a watch. And I hope that you learned something from it. So stay tuned, and thanks for listening.